The news of the world, Wednesday, February 25th. Once again, Columbia's correspondents in world capitals and in the fighting zones in the Western Pacific are ready to give you the latest news direct by shortwave radio.
And now for news of our own West Coast, we take you to Los Angeles and the report of Byron Palmer.
Anti-aircraft guns went into action against unidentified aircraft in the Los Angeles area shortly after 3 a.m. Pacific wartime this morning. The anti-aircraft guns began barking during a blackout ordered by the 4th Interceptor Command at 2:25 a.m. The unidentified object, which some sources thought might be a blimp, moved slowly down the Pacific coast from Santa Monica and disappeared south of Long Beach. Army officials declined to comment on the possibility that the object might have been a blimp. However, it required nearly 30 minutes to travel some 25 miles, far slower than an airplane. Watchers on the rooftop of the Columbia Broadcasting Building in the heart of Hollywood could plainly see the flashes of guns and searchlights sweeping the skies in a wide arc along the coastal area. Concussion of the shells could be felt in downtown Los Angeles, 15 miles away. U.S. Army planes quickly took to the dark skies, but whether they contacted the object has not been announced. Army officials say they will not comment until they receive a full report of the action. Several observers say they saw one or more planes spotlighted by 20 or 30 searchlights. The object moved on southward to about Long Beach on the coast. Searchlights closely followed the object down the coast and kept it centered in their glare. Shells frequently could be seen bursting near the object, but none appeared to hit it. The shooting stopped about 3:30 a.m. The shooting brought warfare to the front door of this city of 1.25 million population for the first time since December 7th. Approximately 20 minutes after the firing died down, the ship returned and headed westward from Long Beach toward Santa Monica. The guns went into action again, hurling round after round of shells at the object. The second barrage appeared to be closer to downtown Los Angeles, since watchers could hear the concussion of the guns more clearly, and the flash of bursting shells was brighter. Then the ship disappeared for the second time over the ocean. We return you now to...
It was just like a weird thing. So it's considered, I guess, by the experts over at Wikipedia to be the start of modern American UFO sightings, and it possibly fits that definition, unidentified flying objects. But so a couple of months after Pearl Harbor, an incident happened over the skies of Los Angeles, and the United States started unloading barrages of anti-aircraft armaments into the sky for hours, and then it was just a whole mess.
It's not the most interesting of the UFO stories.
It really isn't. Once you peel back that one layer, and it's like, oh, they were probably shooting at nothing. Everybody was scared. There'd been a lot of submarine attacks in the area. Everybody has these frayed nerves, and then something sets it off, But once you get underneath that, it's just all details, like so-and-so gave this order at 3:03 a.m., like that kind of thing.
Well, let's give it a little bit more credit than that. I haven't done a whole lot of research on it, but this one is kind of close to my heart because it is what is considered the first incident in the modern American UFO.
Yeah, and I guess it's interesting for purely sociological reasons, though.
Well, okay. Just give it a brief rundown, because there are some interesting things that happen here.
There are a lot of interesting tidbits. Why were they shooting? Well, or that's the first question. Why were they shooting?
If you're in Los Angeles and you don't know what's going on.
You're like, why are they shooting? And then that's like, well, they thought they saw enemy aircraft. Okay, were there enemy aircraft? We can't find any evidence of enemy aircraft. Okay, and now everybody's panicking. Everybody's trying to find an excuse or something to pin it on. And we end up at the weather balloon is what they blamed it on. There were some people floating weather balloons that night, believe it or not.
And did this happen like in really quick succession?
It happened over the course of a couple of hours. And one thing when Skylar and I were like going over it was one of the craziest things is these guys, these foolish guys during wartime release a weather balloon into the night. This is how the story goes. And then the military of the United States blows that fucking weather balloon into the next dimension with how many bullets they put into that fucking thing.
Yeah.
And everywhere around that thing. I mean, so
for it to be just that, it's a little...
Yeah, but then the next thing that happens is after that, release another weather balloon into the sky.
They're like, dang it, that one didn't work.
Yeah. So they fire another one off.
Yeah.
And this, according to some official documents, is like what kept that party going. But there were other things, like the guy that claimed that he saw 200 planes in the sky. Like, what is he talking about?
Yeah,
like, this is a real thing.
It's like a harbor for crazy people, I guess. I mean, it always has been.
So the whole thing about the story has always been, was there anything there for them to be shooting at? And
well, there's also the iconic photograph, which
there is an iconic photograph.
Drew me in on it. And again, I want to give it a little more credit, because if you're an American citizen, a civilian in 1942, is it 42 that this happened, or 41?
It was 42.
Okay, yeah. And
it's 2 months after Pearl Harbor. Everyone was a little bit on edge.
And then the media, which is it's their job to report this stuff. But you get a photograph like that, and it's on every newspaper. Like, it's an amazing photograph. It's really, like, honestly, I was just looking at it before we sat down and started talking, and it kind of gave me chills, because it gives you a sense, if you're just looking at it, that there's no way that there wasn't something up there in the sky above Los Angeles at this time when this is happening. Like, it seems very strange. It seems like if you accept the fact that the military knows what they're doing, which they may or may not know.
Okay, this is Alex during editing. When you hear that sound that you just heard, this one, that's an audio asterisk, or I guess a footnote, but I like audio asterisk better. It means that I'm going to be adding something that we weren't talking about specifically in the original conversation. In this case, I thought about this exact thing later, the idea of whether they knew what they were doing. And at the time, I thought maybe it didn't matter because everybody was under such a high amount of stress. But now I wonder if a conscription-based military where you have a greater sampling from the general population that you would normally, that means that the organization as a whole might be more powerful, but a lot of those individuals may be less professional or competent in certain ways. So I don't know if there's anything to that. I just thought it was worth mentioning. Anyway, all right, take it away, Skylar. If the military knew what they were doing, which may or may not be true, go.
The military knows what they're doing, which they may or may not know. I mean, clearly the weather balloon dudes didn't have a fucking clue what they were doing.
Yeah.
But if you give them that a little bit of like, you put your trust in what they're doing, that they're running an operation to protect the homeland, within 2 months of Pearl Harbor, that they've got to at least know a little bit about what they're doing. Because if you don't believe that, then, it's all FUBAR.
In part of the photograph, one of the most interesting, disturbing parts of it is that they're all shining their spotlights to the same spot.
The same place.
Which makes me believe that they saw something. Like, the only way that this could make sense otherwise is if they're, like, flashing them all over the place, and then there were just a million photographs taken, which I suspect is not the case.
Yeah.
And one of them happened to land on a time where the spotlights intersected in one spot. Like, that's the only other way. But really, probably the simplest conclusion is they were shining their spotlights at one area and then they got the photograph. But it's like right on the same spot. And that's clearly where they're shooting it too.
Yeah.
So they picked up something. I feel like, I mean...
Well, this was picked up on radar, which we discussed this too. We weren't sure whether the weather balloons would have been detectable on radar, but I think we talked, and they are, obviously, because you have to have a way to track where they are. Now, at this time, radar, I believe, was a fairly new technology.
Yeah, they hadn't perfected it yet, that's for sure.
So there were likely some issues with that. Now,
but they all seem to be malfunctioning in the same way then, all of the equipment.
Right. So there's another curiosity about just the story, which I know it's a boring one, but this is one of the interesting things. I believe, if I remember right, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but there was intelligence about a potential attack on Los Angeles much earlier in the day, if not a day before.
Yeah, everyone was on red alert because of that. This is one of those things. This is why I say it's interesting for sociological reasons, because it's almost like, I mean, I don't think it was a mass delusion, but it kind of behaves that same way.
It does, you're right.
And I just wish we knew what the actual... If we had like a list of all the facts, and I mean, right now we only have like 20% of them. If we had all of them, I'd be really interested to see what lines up. You know, this story is almost much more interesting to me if there was nothing in the sky. Although that doesn't seem to be the case, because again, they're all like shooting for the same place.
There may have been something, but it may have been...
I didn't realize they had aircraft that could get that far, but I guess they were sinking boats. That was the other thing. They were the Japanese Navy was sinking ships, like a lot of ships, outside of the San Francisco area, which I haven't heard much about that.
Close to home.
Yeah, that's definitely you have concerns that they can come to you at that point. As a matter of fact, and we don't address it in this conversation specifically, I think we just talk around it, is that the Battle of Los Angeles happened one day after the bombardment of Elwood near Santa Barbara. The bombardment of Elwood, just quickly pulling up on Wikipedia, says it was during World War II. It was a naval attack by a Japanese submarine against United States coastal targets near Santa Barbara, California. Damage was minimal, but the event was key in triggering the West Coast invasion scare and influenced the decision to intern Japanese Americans. The event also marked the first shelling of the North American mainland during the conflict.
So, okay, I'm just going to get a little bit conspiratorial here because we just
speculate wildly. That's the entire point of us doing this. Why would we be doing this if we couldn't?
We discussed, and we may need to contact our surrogate researchers for this one. But one of the theories about the reason that if you're going to go ahead and suspend your disbelief and assume that aliens are visiting us, and this may have been one of those incidents. One of the theories about this during World War II is that while we were testing nuclear weapons, that some alien civilization was able to detect that signature coming from planet Earth, and it was an alarming kind of thing, and so they sent some of their homies here to check it out, to be like, what are these apes doing?
Like when the Vulcans scanned and saw warp drive coming from our solar system, and that's how,
yeah. So when was the Trinity test?
I thought it was later, but I don't know the exact time. I thought all this stuff was...
Should we ask one of our researchers?
Maybe. Trinity was the codename of the first detonation of a nuclear device, and it was conducted by the United States Army at 5:29 a.m. on July 16th, 1945, as part of the Manhattan Project. Anyway, I don't know about this one, boys. Good luck.
I mean, I can go out to the shed. I mean, sorry, the office.
I don't...
I'm going to look at it. I'm going to do it.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. I don't have a lot to say about the more conspiratorial stuff.
Well, the reason I mentioned it, so I'm wrong. It was later. You're right. It was way later. It was 1945.
So
Was it? Dang. That seems so...
I think they had been working on... well, I don't know. I mean, a lot of it... I don't know how much of it's declassified, their development of the bomb, but...
well, that was definitely, at least in popular culture, the day that the first nuclear test happened was 1945.
Is this the first time that weather balloon has been used as a reason, or I want to use like neutral language here?
I think
explanation.
As far as I know, I've not.
This is the thing that we've actually looked into since we had this conversation, and boy, oh boy, there's some weird shit with the history of weather balloons as an explanation for mysterious phenomena. And we have a conversation that I haven't edited yet that goes a little bit more into this, although it's not, the tone of it is not super serious, so we might talk more about it later on. Stay tuned for that. I would be interested to know if this was the first time that the United States government used weather balloon as an explanation. It is the earliest that I am currently aware of, but I'm still doing research into that topic. Although in B of LA's case, it might have been just because everyone was trying to save face. Do we think that maybe because I totally believe that this is like a situation where a bunch of mistakes compounded on top of one another, and this is just a crazy situation that got out of control. That's probably true. But you might also, if you're in the PR offices at the military, be learning some lessons. Maybe later, if you are trying to cover something up, you realize that weather balloon makes a perfect scapegoat for this shit because it actually happened to you one time. The best lies echo reality. Because the other explanation, we get weather balloons a lot, and I'm definitely going to do some research about like why that is. I'm sure there are some completely like benign esoteric reasons why weather balloons just so happen to be the thing. But the other one we hear all the time is owls and or birds. I'll be interested to find out who is using that explanation, when it's being used, that kind of stuff, because that's a really common trope among a lot of these stories.
Yeah, I do think that this is at least, and I'm no expert, and I only kind of look at this stuff as...
If you've come here for expertise, you have been greatly misled.
I'm just saying, I realized before we were getting together today that I really enjoy this topic, and I would say that I probably have more knowledge on it than the average person, than the lay person, but also I am like woefully underinformed about details and things like that. It's more just a curiosity to me.
I think almost everybody who knows about this story has around the same level of knowledge and investment in the story. I've never met anyone or heard of anyone who is truly into this. The thing you said earlier about there's no real protagonist in this story except for the city of Los Angeles itself, or like the military or whatever. That's a very interesting idea, and this is probably something we'll have to think about more later on when we get into some of the weirder, more complicated ones. I'll also be interested to see in retrospect what other tropes we can mine from this story after the fact.
You had mentioned, one of the things that just came to mind is you had mentioned, and we're going to discuss, I'm sure, the Phoenix Lights at some point.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you had mentioned that there were some similarities between this and
just
the Phoenix
visually.
Lights. Yeah.
As a matter of fact, this is one of those situations where we are actually more right on the money than I think even we realized during the taping of this conversation. Some of it likely has to do with the way that we construct narratives in general, but that's a lot of why this is interesting to me. So here are some broad tropes that appear in both B of LA and the Phoenix Lights. Number 1. Both of these stories lack a protagonist and an antagonist. Number 2, these stories happen to a lot of people, like countless people, all at the same time. Number 3, somewhat related, both stories occur over a major American metropolitan area. Number 4, the military is present in both of these stories and is seen as both A, morally neutral, and B, covering up the truth / engaging in some kind of deception. Number 5, while never outright stated, the connotation of the military's deception is typically portrayed in terms of trying to contain panic, and the military is implied to not necessarily know what happened either. This is noteworthy because they are not seen as a villain, e.g. in the Roswell incident. The military is more or less portrayed as the evil empire trope, and they are the primary antagonists in Jesse Marcel and Glenn Dennis's stories. More on that in a future episode. In B of LA and TPL, the trope is more of like, quote, the good army, end quote. You can contrast this with a story like Rendlesham Forest, which we will also cover at some point, in which a UFO encounter that also involves multiple people ends with every one of them thinking that they are the protagonist. You can also make the comparison to the film Independence Day. You know, like in that movie, they probably borrowed a lot from a lot of these different kinds of things.
Yeah.
Though I think that may have happened before the Phoenix Lights. But anyway, that's like a visual, it's like a common visual analog or whatever.
It's just... Oh, we also talked about it would be interesting to talk to some of the people that were there in LA at the time, which there are probably few and far between that remember it at this point. But I guarantee you there are people out there that remember this.
Yeah, that would be interesting to know more about. Although it was probably just complete chaos. I think one of the reasons that control was lost was because everyone was just kind of doing their own thing. Nobody knew what was going on. And
so there was, you don't think that, okay. So let's say there was something that the military was firing on.
There may have been something, but it didn't warrant the barrage it got.
Did not warrant the barrage it got. But I'm asking, if there was something, then it stands to reason that maybe someone, if not more than, like if this were happening over Springfield, I can guarantee you I would be like standing on the porch like, the fuck? And like trying to see, you know, I might even call you and be like, hey, do you have binoculars or
maybe not
scope that we can look through or something?
Maybe not if you know that you're in the middle of a war and attacks have been happening recently, and this is like a thing where probably if you're outside of your house when something like that is going on, you're in real danger,
right?
From your own people, even, because they're just going to assume you're a target.
Run outside and look at a tornado when it's tearing through. They're hiding in their basements.
Yeah.
But then there are people that do.
Yeah, I'm sure there would be some looky-loos if it was going on, but I don't think it would be as common.
Yeah, it'd be hard to find.
Because my first impulse, without context, would be to go out and check it out. Yeah. But if you're in the middle of 1942 and Pearl Harbor's just happened a few weeks before, and you know, you're thinking about this stuff a little bit differently.
You're hiding your family and trying to protect them and all of that. Well,
it's only later that it becomes weird, because when it's happening, maybe a few people are like, there was nothing up there. But most of the people are just going to believe, oh, well, obviously they're shooting at something. They have a reason to be shooting.
They assume it was the Japanese and...
Yeah. It was only later that everybody kind of shrugged and was like, well, we can't find any reason for us to have been shooting. And then everybody gives different reports on what they saw or didn't see. I'd really like to know more from the guy that thought he saw 200 planes. I really want to know what was going on there.
So they did. So there are interviews that happened after the fact with civilians.
Yeah, there would have had to have been, because there were, I think, a couple of different commissions.
You might have to freaking go out to LA to some library to look up some of those, honestly, because I mean, it is.
Yeah.
It's, as far as the UFO lore, this one's a bit esoteric. I mean, I think it's not, everybody knows Roswell. Most people know of Rendlesham Forest and those kinds of things, or the Phoenix Lights. But if you mention Battle of Los Angeles, like I did the other day at work, and they were like, "Oh, the Rage Against the Machine album," and I was
I'm glad that they were confused about that, frankly.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't even know that was a Rage Against the Machine album until a couple of years ago. I always associated it with the UFO incident, but
yeah, it's
no offense, Rage. I love you guys, but
I'd really like for this story to have more in it, but I also think that it'll be more interesting in retrospect. I'd like to revisit this later after we've gone through it and seen some of the trends and the narratives. I
was going to say that. You mentioned, and this is what we were talking about before, the tropes. There's so much.
This is an American mythology.
It is, and it's the foundation of it, but it's also there's so it makes sense that this would be sort of the archetype in a disappointing way, I guess. Because, what do you have next to look forward to is the Roswell incident, which...
It does set the trend of, even if everything is not true, doesn't... That almost, in this case, it actually makes a story more interesting to me for there to not have been any UFO at all. Although, I mean, probably there was something that set off their radar. That seems pretty reasonable. It's telling that we keep trying to find ways to make this more interesting to ourselves. That's almost a component of it, too, though, because this happens a lot with later UFO and other paranormal stories where I feel like elements get added.
It becomes folklore.
We're probably actually going to talk about this too with the Betty and Barney Hill, because I think it happens by accident, even by the participants.
Yeah.
But frankly, that actually hasn't happened with this story too much. I mean, most of the sources I've read have been pretty unbiased, but that's also probably a consequence of it not being as famous or as quote unquote important to UFO lore. We're probably going to... Of course, all the crazies showed up for Roswell because that was a thing that everybody knew about and talked about, and it kept coming back every couple of decades. Yeah.
Yeah. It kind of makes sense, though, in that way, that it would be there's not enough... You mentioned that there are a lot of mundane details, and it's sort of tedious, dissecting how this all went
but
down.
They're all important is the other problem.
They are all important, but that's what I mean is there isn't enough there's almost not enough lore behind this for it to be the kind of sea change event within UFO culture or American culture that Roswell was. So that I think also though lends sort of a power to it that maybe it's one of those things where it's a flashpoint in the culture that then kind of paves the way where it's a blank slate for then the next event to be something that really becomes embedded in people's minds and the zeitgeist,
so,
as you said.
One thing that would be really interesting to know, and something that I haven't been able to nail down, is when did Battle of Los Angeles go from being a news story to a UFO story or a something more story?
I said the other day.
Here's another interesting component of it. So earlier you were talking about the sort of way that the the fire in the sky type trope, like Constantinople before the battle, etc. That's a specific example you brought up.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting because the sort of modern American version of this trope, which, I mean, it appears all over the fucking place. There's Simba talks to his father in the sky. You can think
on
of
the road to Damascus, I think.
yeah, that's another one. Yeah. This is an imagery that's all over our culture and has been for thousands and thousands of years.
And the wheel.
Sure, yeah. I mean, we can come up with, churches. Yeah. They have the high windows up with the figures in them specifically because they're trying to mimic this upwards. Revelatory, and that's why, good is considered up, etc. Anyway, different mythologies treated differently, and then it's kind of interesting that the flashpoint for modern American UFO sightings and that whole mythos that we're going to be getting into is started by the Second World War, like the biggest war of all time. And it was the first one with these flying machines. And it was the first time that we were fighting a war where man had conquered the sky, a place that we were never supposed to go.
Yeah.
And this is we all have this experience at once all over the world where we're sort of traumatized by this, but it's this feeling of power and freedom as well. And of course, Americans have a very specific kind of relationship with the airplane. So yeah, there's a lot going on there. And this is the event that starts it off, more or less.
So, because we're not going to, I guess, do a deep dive into the Battle of Los Angeles.
Yeah.
We should discuss sort of maybe the impact, we've been touching on, after the fact.
Yeah. The impact, that's a really interesting question.
Because you would think that something this, that close to Pearl Harbor is something that, I mean, that would have been that would have been the biggest news in the country for a very long time. And in fact, I mean,
I can understand why the 9/11 comparison is probably apt. And it's traumatizing for everyone involved in a deep way that I don't think you can unpack for probably generations. And so, yeah, everybody was going through that. And then it happens in the wake of this very quickly after, and the attacks didn't stop.
Well, and it leaves so much, there's so much question there. There's no...
Absolutely.
It's not like with Pearl Harbor, I'm sure there were people that were like, what the fuck is going on? This, and then after, in the wake of that, we're like, I mean, anything traumatic and awful like that breeds conspiracy and breeds wild speculation or whatever. But there was nothing really to follow up on this one. And you would think that a city that had just been, I mean, based on the reaction of the military under siege, that there would be,
My suspicion is that it's because it does not have those very mythological qualities. I think because it lacks those things, or even just nobody cared enough about it at the time to develop a sort of powerful narrative.
How could you not care enough about it?
Well, everybody, I mean, Pearl Harbor's just happened. I know. Remember after 9/11 and George Bush had an approval rating of above 90%? Can you imagine being a person who would speak out against going to Afghanistan in the weeks after 9/11?
Yeah.
You're not going to speak out against the military of America. They're fucking protecting you. Pearl Harbor just happened. You don't want that to happen to you. You want to support your troops and all of that, So there's a lot of pro-government, pro-military, pro-the-system sentiment. And that takes almost an entire generation to get away from, the 60s is when they finally stopped doing that.
So I don't want to talk about Roswell specifically, but why do you think then?
Not yet. Yeah, we're definitely gonna talk about it.
Why do you think though? Then within the decade, that became the quintessential UFO story. I mean,
Well,
it has a lot of the same elements, you know.
The American UFO mythology was born out of a traumatic experience with the aircraft. What are UFO abductions and sightings? They are traumatic experiences that Americans have with what? Aircraft or otherworldly beings or whatever. People that you can't understand. This is a machine that symbolizes being in a space that you're not supposed to be, like being more powerful than, like, the aircraft is humanity bending something to its will. It's
that kind of
a signal.
On the nuclear bomb thing I mentioned.
It does, yeah. And all of these things are compacted into the same sort of. These are all part of all this sort of stuff happening, and it imprints itself upon the people that are a part of it. We just went through this with COVID. This is going to be the same thing for us.
Right. So I mentioned Rage Against the Machine while I'm continuing accidental-ish references to 90s alternative bands that I love. What do you know about the Foo Fighters?
Not a whole lot. Not a huge fan.
Not the band.
Oh, the actual thing? I know even less.
Even less? I don't know much about it, but I know that, I guess, and I believe that these UFO sightings happened on, it was the European theater. So that's where they first originated, was there would be British pilots that were seeing glowing balls of light that would trace their craft or like follow their aircraft, or even do things like, as they were flying in X direction, circle their craft or their plane.
As we go through these stories, I'm definitely going to want to draw just a tiny bit of attention to where these things are happening at, because I think that UFO stories for Europeans and Americans and other parts of the world, I just think it symbolizes different kinds of things.
They have different sort of. If I was the powerful alien, if I was an alien, I would want to come visit the United States. I'm probably biased.
Same.
But so I mean, just throwing that out there, maybe the aliens that are coming and visiting us are the real ones.
They just know how to have a good time.
Yeah, they like to party. But yeah, no, there is something to that, Alex. That, like, while there are common threads in these kinds of things, like the Foo Fighters are glowing balls of light. We mentioned that the last time we talked about this. Like that's one of, it'd be interesting to get a chart of like the types of UFOs that people see and sort of where those things happen. But
yeah.
The Foo Fighters, I don't think that they were ever described as anything other than that, other than like a glowing ball of light. And I believe that the pilots there at the time were thinking that they, of course, as you would, thinking that they were some sort of like enemy aircraft, experimental aircraft or something like that. So,
oh yeah, that I think that would always be my first assumption.
I just mentioned the Foo Fighters because I believe that the Foo Fighter phenomena was happening before the Battle of Los Angeles. I could be wrong because I'm wrong about my timelines on this stuff a lot.
Foo Fighter sightings occurred in 1944, so Battle of Los Angeles actually predates that phenomenon.
But I think that there were already like these kinds of things being talked about.
We are here for the rampant speculation.
So are you cool to touch on Kenneth Arnold then? Because I believe that's the next important American.
Sure. I haven't done any research on it whatsoever, so
this is this one's close to my heart.
We're probably going to want to talk about this later then, because I want to
actually know some shit about it, right?
Yeah.
I just wanted to mention it because
We can talk about it.
in the chronology of these things that we're talking about. Like I think Foo Fighters, and then the Battle of Los Angeles, and then Kenneth Arnold, and then Roswell. So I just wanted to mention the Kenneth Arnold thing because the description of the UFOs that he saw while he was flying a plane, much in the same way that the pilots described the Foo Fighters as like these balls of light, he described boomerang-shaped like aircraft, like a flying wing, essentially.
Oh,
so
interesting.
Here in America, it seems to be that we have this sense of like, these things aren't necessarily like sort of immaterial. They are very much mechanical in the way we describe them when people see these things,
Yeah.
There may be something to that.
Yeah, that's true. I wonder about any cases of people claiming to see UFOs or other alien technology that if they don't always describe it as some kind of metal or... I'm going to help me out here. I think what I'm trying to get at is that there's something buried deep in us when it comes to metal, including our general conception of how ancient civilizations developed. We've got the Bronze Age, the Iron Age. We have these new metals that we are working with become big technical innovations. A lot of times it has to do with weaponry. Later on in the world history, it has to do with travel. We talk about the airplane, but one thing we didn't talk about as much as a car. I don't think before the 20th century it was very common for people to imagine themselves riding around in metal machines. But if there is an alien race, there is no reason why they would necessarily have to have a metal machine. Like maybe they, I don't know, ride around in some kind of flesh pods in space or something. It could be anything. Maybe they construct stuff out of stone or ice or something. Who knows? We always think of them as metal craft. You could make the argument that if they're similar enough to us that we would recognize them as similar, then they would need something like a metal craft. But it's a trope and it's an assumption, and I think it's worth recognizing.
Well, we talked about this a while back. And I don't remember exactly the context, but we were talking about, like you mentioned, like metal, or these things like tend to be the way that alien or UFOs are described. They're like metallic or mechanical in some way. And I think you and I would agree that metal is probably the most like essential engine for technological advancement, aside from our minds or our brains.
That's true. There's a lot of questions about xenobiology here too. So I mean, it makes sense that for an alien being to be interacting with us in the first place, they probably have some pretty fundamental similarities to us. An extreme example at the other end would be if we don't recognize a life as life and we just don't see it that way, then we're not going to be able to communicate with it because we just don't see it as being life in the first place. So it makes sense that aliens that we would recognize as advanced aliens would have technological elements that we would recognize. The other part of it is we can only recognize the technological things that we understand, so we might be imposing our limited understanding onto those things. Like they just look metallic, even though maybe they aren't.
Right. I want to stick on this metal thing for a second, though.
Sure.
Because in the case of the Battle of Los Angeles, this is a military operation, right? We're defending our homeland. So this is war time we're talking about, right? And while we don't have any definitive actual description of the UFO in question, we have, people that say like, 200 airplanes or some sort of like craft in the sky. It would be reasonable to assume. Oh, I think there was another one that described that thought it was a Zeppelin.
Yeah, there was one guy that thought it was a Zeppelin, one guy that thought there was 200, and I think those were the outliers. I think most people assumed or thought that it was a single Japanese scout plane. I think that's what most people thought they were shooting at.
So, and this is going to sound a little bit elementary here, but the weapons of war are made of metal, and they have been made of metal for millennia.
Yeah.
So I think there's something to that sense of like technological progress, and that these things would be made of metal, because you think about how we developed weapons over time. I mean,
it's also a big part of what the mythology is about in the first place. You're right. Progress as an abstraction, like a thing unto itself that has its own quality and dimension in our life. That idea has only been around for a very small amount of time, right? The Industrial Revolution is when this whole thing started. Economies started getting better. People started getting richer. The standard of living went up. From the Bronze Age to the year 1750, those people's lives looked pretty much the same. There were like some advancements here and there, and we could probably name them all. The printing press, the stirrup, the double-edged plow. Like, these are things that
I was thinking of steel.
Steel is a big one,
Yeah.
but these are like the greatest advances that anyone sees for hundreds of years afterwards. And now we went from like steam engines to planes to microchip computers. These are 100, each of those is a 100-year leap. I mean, that's crazy. Imagine, in less than 100 years, we went from having a plane to putting a person on the moon. Progress is a dominant force in our lives now in a way that it wasn't before. And the word progress is really loaded, but that's part of the point, because to unpack these loaded things, we tell stories to ourselves, and that's how we make sense of the world around us.
So you mentioned a couple of times the idea that people are describing these things that they believe that they're seeing using the terminology that they have based on whatever they're able to experience during their period of time.
Yeah, because
Right.
it's the only vocabulary they have.
So here's what I'm curious about. There is a period of time before the modern UFO era, I guess we'll call it. So like World War II and on, where unidentified flying objects were seen and reported about.
They were mostly seen as supernatural, right?
Well, I think so, but not. What I'm getting at is that you mentioned the steam engine, and there are some earlier instances of UFO sightings where the craft is described as emitting like a jet of smoke or, steam or something like that.
For example, there was a series of sightings in the late 1800s, referred to as the mystery airships, and we actually have a more detailed conversation about this during the Roswell series that we're working on. Part of the reason that we're doing the modern UFO stuff is because all of these ideas, all of the cultural understanding that we have, the stuff that you've just gotten from osmosis, none of that existed. The way that they would talk about these sightings is completely different. And the common understanding of what basic words and definitions are has changed over time. So there's a lot to unpack. Even going back 80 years is a bit problematic, but boy, oh boy, there's so much.
So if some of these like sightings, if we could go back, because I believe that there's one that's sticking out in my head that I believe happened in like the 1860s, which there were steam engines at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you would think it stands to reason again that like that's how that would be described. Like it, but
yeah,
a flying ship like that, a flying craft or what? I don't know. I'm at a loss for words to really.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine what they would have.
But you wouldn't think of it as like an isolated, sort of insulated thing. Like if your knowledge of like the most modern technology was a train or something like that, you might think like maybe they would describe it as like a locomotive in the sky or something.
I'm going to help you out a little bit, because flying machines of one type or another had been in the public consciousness for a while at that point.
Balloons and
yeah,
blimps and things, I think.
Even more fantastical ones that wouldn't actually work in real life. However, I understand what you're saying. Like, it's not a thing it's not a thing you run into all the time. You may not have... Okay, sorry. I know it's a lot of footnotes. I just want to point out that we did talk about this a little bit earlier in the conversation. The sky is a place that we were never meant to be. And so it makes sense that it just wouldn't have been in the cultural consciousness to the same extent as it is now. And it also makes sense that you would see sky people as being a little more supernatural. Like, it makes sense to me that you would think of them as gods or something instead of just really advanced humans, because why would you be a person in the sky? That doesn't make any sense. What, are you crazy? Like, what, we're going to fling a giant metal tube into the air and expect it not to crash? Come on now. It's not a thing you run into all the time. You may not have discussed this out loud with anyone before, so you don't have any kind of vocabulary for this experience. It's very difficult to find the words. I mean, the only option you have is using the words of your day. This is all you have. And so I want to remind ourselves that, as with the experience in 1860, where the person is, using language of their time, I would want us to remember that it was probably, whatever it was, something else entirely. And in 1947, when Roswell happens and they describe it in such and such way, we need to apply that same framework onto these people as well. Even though they're modern and have more in common with us, it does not mean that their descriptions are going to be accurate or correct. And we need to remember that.
Yeah.
We should be careful with how we assess how these people are describing the experiences they're having.
Yeah.
That's just another layer between us and the truth.
Man. We gotta peel back those layers, man.
Yeah, Layers of Truth. It's my new prog rock album. God, could you imagine? That's the most pretentious thing I've ever thought
I'll play
of.
on it.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, we're gonna get the boys together to jam that one out.
It's okay, honey. We're getting the band back together. Yeah.
It's really hard to think of more interesting stuff to say about Battle of Los Angeles. I'm excited to move on to some of the other stories that are like more iconic.
So one thing I do want to say, and we just discussed this briefly, is we've been talking about like the tropes, these sort of like elemental things that they don't define the story, but they're always part of the story.
Yeah.
So we were discussing the weather balloon thing. It seems like when you look at these stories, and I'm not as familiar with the ones that are not Americana, basically. But when the military is involved, there's always an explanation along the lines of a weather balloon or some sort of military project or something, that was going on. Like even the Phoenix Lights, I think that the official military explanation was that there was a operation or a practice thing that they were doing, and there were flares that were launched.
Yeah.
So it's always something.
We're definitely gonna get into that one.
Those are the ones that involve the military directly, and then the other ones like the Betty and Barney Hill case or the Mothman, or Travis Walton's experience is a bit different. We need to touch that one though, anyway. But I'm trying to think of another one that's kind of along those lines. What was it? The Flatwoods Monster.
Oh yeah.
All of those though kind of are like, there are experts that come in and say like, oh, maybe it was an owl or maybe it was a bird or some explanation like that. Mm-hmm. And that seems to be sort of like a bifurcation or like a dividing line between how these incidents, at least in the lore, they get explained.
Yeah.
So that was the only other thing I think I had to mention about that.
I think when the experts come in, it's going to be more helpful to think of these things as the best possible explanation given what we know is this. And then if that explanation is actually absurd, which is what happens in some of these cases, then, by the way, then you still don't get to think it's aliens, because the way science works is then you think, well, I must just not have enough information to make this make sense. And so we have to move ahead with this best explanation. But in my heart of hearts and everybody else that I know, we all agree that it's probably not correct. Of course, it's fun to speculate wildly. Again, that's why we are here doing this. This is the fun part of it, right? Not really with the Battle of LA, because it just seemed like it was a confusing mess. 2 out of 10, if I had to actually give it a review score. Just as a story.
It gets a 2 out of 10 as a UFO story, not a 2 out of 10 as a story, because it's extremely interesting. There just isn't enough lore to sink our teeth into.
2 out of 10 for sure.
It's got interesting components to it, but
it laid the groundwork
for
this other stuff. So I've got to give it credit for that.
And as a sort of like psychic echo of Pearl Harbor, it's like the military is just literally shooting at ghosts. So I wanted to cover that because it's like foreshadowing. It may not, it's a little seed right now, this the UFO stuff, but it's been planted now.
What a strange time to be alive during World War II. Like,
yeah, it would have been.
To think that between the Battle of Los Angeles and 1945, 41 to 45, we would see the atom bomb.
The atom bomb literally is and the Holocaust, which again, these are all in the stew that we talked about at the same time. There's this real, has science gone too far? And is there a limit? Should we be suspicious of some of this? And what does it mean to be scientific? I think this is when Karl Popper even, maybe in the 30s, or it's around this time, within 10 or 20 years of him coming up with the falsification principle and really popularizing that. And then all of this stuff is going on at the same time. But these are the questions everyone is asking themselves. Is progress inevitable? Are these things a part of progress? What exactly is progress? Yeah, everything like that. And of course, in the 20th century, It's the first century where we even get to think about these things. I mentioned this a little bit in terms of just progress itself, but think about all of the other things as abstractions in our lives that we would not have if it were 150 years ago. Things like, am I happy, is not a question that you would have ever asked yourself. Things about love or romance, certain standards. Like, these are not things you would have even considered 150 years ago.
Existential questions.
A lot of them, yeah.
Were irrelevant.
The very nature of what it means to be a person has changed in the last 150 years. We are not the same that we were then. We are physically, but our brains have not caught up with this, right? Because we have the same brains that we did 300,000 years ago.
Dang, this is like a therapy session for me, homie.
Yeah.
Like,
well, you see, Skylar, what
making me
changed
feel
everything was when the ice cap started melting. It meant that instead of hunting game and foraging for berries, we could grow crops and create agriculture. And this led to a population boom. And you need things to service that population. And now cities are developing. And then, and then it still took 6,000 to 8,000 years for this thing to kick off in the way that it has since the Industrial Revolution.
well, I'm glad to be sitting here across from you at this time.
I love you too, buddy. That's why I wanted to do this with you. So that's our conversation about B of LA. There's going to be a follow-up to this that we're going to do separately, where I am basically going to read some articles I found about B of LA to Skylar, and I found them after we recorded the conversation, so yeah. One of the frustrating things about researching these incidents is that when you go back past a certain point in time, it's really hard to find primary sources. It was difficult with this one in particular because there would be like LA Times articles where they would reference prior articles that were written and quote them, but I couldn't find the original material. And I felt like it was a bit of a risk to buy an LA Times subscription only to find out that their archives don't have what I'm looking for. And on that note, I need to acknowledge that the audio footage of the newscast that I played in the beginning came from a YouTube channel that's a smallish channel. I mean, the channel's bigger than ours, but still relatively small. There is video as well, which is kind of interesting. And also, I edited down the audio footage. So I'll leave a link in the description, but you should go check that channel out, check that video out. I tried to find the original source, and then I was still going to credit the channel with it, but because that's how I found it. But I couldn't find the original source, so that person is doing the Lord's work, and I really appreciate it. And yeah, I guess I don't know how to end these things yet. I guess I just stop recording.